Mike, welcome.
Thank you.
You are a general partner at Index. You started the Silicon Valley office back in 2009?
2011.
2011, okay.
Yep.
And you've had a pretty good last couple of years, if I read correctly, if I remember correctly, 3 IPOs, Zuora, Sonos, and Elastic roughly in the last couple of years.
Yeah,
So
that's right,
congratulations
yeah.
on this.
Thank you.
Regular on the Midas list of the top 100 investors in the world.
As if that means anything, but yes.
And prior to that, you ran a big business at Cisco.
I did, yeah.
The routing business.
Yes. Yep.
Correct. And you acquired 70 companies and ran $10 billion worth of P&L.
Back when I had less gray hair.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. So, look, there's like a bunch of things I want to talk about, which are very relevant to this specific event, this specific audience. But one thing that struck me, which I actually hadn't realized when you and I chatted in the past, because you're such a great investor in technical data, infrastructure, machine learning stuff, but you're also a great consumer investor. So we talked about, Sonos and I guess Blue Bottle Coffee as well.
Yeah.
How does that work? How does one, asking for a friend, like how does one invest successfully in enterprise and consumer businesses?
Well, there's somewhat of a theory behind it, and then there's reality. So the theory is that I think you learn to empathize with the customer if you invest in a consumer company, because data companies or infrastructure companies sell to those companies, and then those companies then use the product. So I'll give you a concrete example around that. One of the slightly less successful but nevertheless relevant consumer companies I invested in was called SoundCloud. SoundCloud had a big problem, which was that they had millions and millions of pieces of content, all of which was sort of consumer annotated, if you will, and users had a very hard time finding content. So the CTO of SoundCloud excitedly in one board meeting pontificates how they found this miracle software that increased the dwell time on the website by 40% by allowing consumers to discover more content, more relevant content. And I said, what is that? And he said, we use this software called Elasticsearch. I was like, really? So tell me about Elasticsearch. And he walks me through it. The next day I called Elasticsearch. We ended up investing in the company a month later, and then it went public. So by being in consumer companies, you learn how infrastructural tools get used, and you often find the good ones. And so that's super relevant. And oftentimes, whether they're using good or bad tools can also be an indicator of whether they're going to be a successful company or not. And so I do find that there's a great deal of synergy by being in both. And that can be very helpful. The other fact of it is, I've been a professional for a lot of years. I've been doing this work for some number of years, and occasionally you just find great entrepreneurs and they're doing random stuff. But, our business is a lot about investing in great entrepreneurs. And so in the case of Blue Bottle, truthfully, I just knew the founder or the CEO, Brian Meehan, and this was his third venture. He'd always been successful. And so it was one of those like, okay, well, I cannot not give him money. I mean, he's going to be successful at what he does. So sometimes it's just happenstance.
Great. So let's start with open source software. So you are one of the big specialists on the investor front of OSS. And it's really interesting, right? I mean, OSS has had, at least in some circles, a bad rep across many years as an investment opportunity, at least, not as a movement. But it started from, hey, you'll never make money with this thing a few years ago, to all the way to today. Well, you can do this, but like Amazon's going to steal your business. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, there are there's a lot of I guess diverging opinions on the space. Maybe for level setting, do you want to walk us through the history? I think you mentioned somewhere I read 3 phases in the evolution of open source software.
Yeah, I mean, Warren Buffett said something interesting, which is in order to be a good investor, you have to have 2 conditions be true. One is that you have to be right, and the other one is that you have to be contrarian. So, when I decided to go deep in this open source thing, I obviously recognize that it was somewhat contrarian because of the first factor that you mentioned. Most people would tell you, like, how can you make money on free software, right? So
Fair question.
it's a fair question. I think that when you have the first principle about open source is that it's a very developer-centric business model. And you have to believe in the thesis that whereas software was once sold through slideware to executives, software is now sold by developers who self-discover and evangelize that software. And open source takes advantage of that. So first you start with that tenet, and then you say, okay, if I believe in being developer first, how do you realistically construct a business model on top of that? By figuring out how to charge some of your customers. And open source really evolved into open core, which is to say that the core piece of software that the developer uses by downloading it on their laptop or running it on an instance in Amazon, that's free. And it's fair for it to be free because A, the developer doesn't have any money anyway, so who cares if they pay you or not? And B, they're actually acting as your marketing department, right? So you spend in an open source business model, you spend less on marketing, you spend less on sales, and you give away that piece of software so that your customer, your developer, is actually your evangelist, your salesperson. Then what you do is you create a suite of proprietary or commercial software that exists around that free model, which tends to be the features or attributes of the software that are utilized by the people that are using the product in production. So that's when you migrate from the developer creating something to actually being pushed into production, and they need a different set of tools. They need all the abilities. They need manageability, observability, they need security, they need alerting and notifications, they need auto-scaling, blah, 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 blah. So all those,
version.
yeah, the enterprise version. And so you construct this model, and you got to realize that you have to be happy with the fact that maybe 80% of your customers don't pay you, right? So it's effectively a freemium business model. And when you don't have that condition, like we invested in Hortonworks, the company did go public. We made 5 times our money on the investment, so it was a good investment. But ultimately, it was a very tough company to build a business out of because they had no proprietary software. It was all open. And so big lesson there, definitely have proprietary software and understand where that boundary condition should be between free and commercial.
That was sort of the second generation, right? Like the first generation.
First generation was all open, all support. So there's MySQL, Red Hat, the first Hadoop companies all fit into that category. Tough way to make a living is the bottom line. Now,
second generation,
second generation is this combination of open core. Third gen is the idea that you're really actually just running a cloud service, right? So effectively, you do have open source. People can see it and read it, but what you're actually selling is the cloud variant of that service. And a number of companies, whether it's Mongo with Atlas, Elastic with Elastic Cloud, Confluent with Confluent Cloud, Cockroach just got Cockroach Cloud, they're basically taking their open source software and running it. And there you charge everybody, right? Because essentially now you are becoming the host or the managed operator of your software. You can still leave the open source one out there for free, and if somebody wants to exert the resources to take your software and run it on Amazon on their own, they probably can get away with it, but they have to sit there and worry about, am I running the latest version? Do I have all the patches? Yada, yada, yada. Whereas if you use a cloud service, you don't have to worry about it. So that's really the third evolution of it. Just to address your last point, which is sort of the Amazon concern, there is a concern, although I think open source companies are quickly shifting their license models to essentially either make it very difficult for Amazon to just run the service or impossible. And that's what's fundamentally happening in the industry right now.
Yeah, so since we're talking about that, so, Cockroach, for example, came up, I guess, a few months ago with a revised license. Do you want to talk about how that's different and what does that do?
Yeah,
and maybe just to backtrack. So the issue we're talking about is the large cloud providers, so Amazon, but there's been like some Chinese cloud providers as well. So Amazon created this their distribution of Elasticsearch.
Well, so the context is this, right? The original open source companies all principally came through the Apache Foundation. So you had an Apache license from the foundation, and that basically set in stone the fact that anybody could use the software any way you wanted to. So Amazon or a Chinese service provider, whoever could comfortably take it and run the software with it, and that's what like Elastic MapReduce on Amazon runs on. Gen 2 is an Apache 2.0 license. Those you're not, you can carve out proprietary attributes out of it. You can fork it and so on and so forth. What you're seeing now, and there's many variants of it, the cockroach one is called a BSL or a business, I forget what it stands for, business service license or business software license. What that basically says is that you essentially, Amazon cannot take that software and compete proactively with cockroach with it, right? So they can make something that's API compatible, but they can't actually run that software. Mongo took an interesting similar approach. They have something called SSPL. In that case, it says you can take it, but any software that you build around it to run it, you have to open source it. So Amazon will have to open source its entire software base used to run Mongo. So what Amazon did is they ditched the Mongo source code. They wrote something called DocumentDB, which is a copy, effectively, with API compatibility to Mongo, and launched that. So you're essentially gradually making life miserable for Amazon to try to copy you. And then the other thing that you do as a business is you partner with Google and Azure, who, because they're pretty far behind Amazon, they're more than happy to have the original item and to pay you something for the privilege of running your version. So if you look at the latest announcement from Google or from Facebook or from Microsoft, sorry, they have Confluent running in the cloud, the original version. They have Redis, they have Mongo, they have Elastic, and so on and so forth. So you put pressure on Amazon by saying, hey, these people are running the real version, you're running the knockoff, and hopefully the customer base kind of shifts over to Google and Azure.
So we talked about the evolution of the business model. We talked about the evolution of licenses. How do you think about the role of community in that third evolution of open source? The community initially was all about developers, right? Actually building the product.
Yeah, community, the role of community, I think, has really changed in the open source industry. It used to be that the community was the developer agent, like they actually wrote code that you integrated. Nowadays, most of these open source companies, 95% of the code is written by employees, and the 5% are like patches or connectors or something like that that the community is building. The community's job is really to provide a closed loop feedback system on the quality of what you're building, right? So they are your product management group that is telling you, yeah, I like this feature. No, this one is not written well. This one doesn't scale. You have data duplication over here. I don't like that, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not writing the software. They're giving you the feedback of what's wrong or where your priorities should be. So the community is still very important, but it's gone from basically substituting for your engineering org to substituting for your product management organization.
And Q&A.
And Q&A, of course, absolutely. Yeah. And marketing, evangelism.
Interesting. I'm talking about Elastic as I was prepping for this. This very common idea in venture circle that when you start a company, you should just have one product. Elastic, is a very famous company for having multiple products, the ELK stack. And if you think about some of the hottest startups in the valley right now, whether it's GitLab or HashiCorp, or there seems to be a trend towards multi-product companies. Do you think that's
I would say that I'm still in the camp of have one thing that works.
Yeah.
In Elasticsearch eventually did ELK and then a bunch of other stuff. But at the heart of it was Elasticsearch. And that was the only thing, when we invested, that's all they had. And then they co-opted the Kibana people and the Logstash people to join the company to make ELNK. But it really was one product in the beginning. I think you do have models to the contrary, Hashi obviously being the case. But I still think you're better off, especially when you're getting started, creating repeatability in how you engage with your customers is just so important that even though there are models to the contrary, I think I would still very much subscribe to the notion of focus in the beginning, build repeatable motions, and then expand.
And so you've had those very successful investments in sort of the core infrastructure of big data. I guess I don't know if anybody still talks about big data, but that's sort of like 2012 to 2016 phase around the core, Hadoop and like Elastic and just like and I guess Confluent at the tail end of it. Do you think we done with that phase of innovation in that core market, or is that something that just constantly gets reinvented?
No, not at all. My thesis, the broad thesis, I think, is that 50 years ago, businesses, everyday businesses, Marriott Hotels, American Airlines, UPS, they built their competitive advantage over economies of scale in the physical world. You made more cars, you had more hotel rooms, you had more airplanes. That gave you a competitive advantage. I think in the modern era, you have more advantage to the degree that you can derive insights from the data that your business creates. And so I think thematically, the world we're in right now is one where if you can provide tools where businesses can get insights out of their data and conduct their business differently, they get increasing amounts of competitive advantage. So I think big data was sort of like chapter one in that, because obviously you need large amounts of data, but the truth is that the value is in the insight, not in the data, right? And I even think that in that spectrum, sort of data science and machine learning are real cousins, right? In the sense that you collect a pile of data, you massage it, and then in data science, you visualize that data, and then there's a human that looks at that data and says, let's make more green umbrellas this month, right? The machine learning takes that one step further and essentially eliminates the human out of the loop and says, based on pattern matching, which is essentially at the heart of machine learning, I'm going to recommend that you buy 4,000 umbrellas this month, right? But it's all the same thing, right? You're essentially collecting all this information, storing it somewhere, massaging it, and then allowing either a human or a machine to extract an insight out of it. That theme is so early, and there are millions of businesses out there, even the big ones that I just cited, like somebody like American Airlines or Marriott Hotels, and I hope I don't insult anybody in the room, are clueless on how to get insights out of their data. There are a few small, high-end companies, whether you're a bank or a large-scale web tech company, that can actually really get insights out of data, but largely the world is still not able to get that competitive advantage. And I think over the next decade, it's probably, as an enterprise investor, the single most important theme that's going to exist. Mm-hmm. And so I really think we're just getting warmed up in some sense.
Great. And maybe staying on infrastructure for a second, what are you excited about? Is that Multicloud? Is that Kubernetes? Is that or do you not think about the world in those terms?
No, I mean, I generally look at you listen to people and you hear their pain points and you try to find companies that are fixing pain points. Earlier there was a discussion about how much of a pain in the ass data engineering is. And so there should be a few sets of solutions out there that make data engineering easier. Mm-hmm. So we look for companies that do that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I think one of the big challenges that we face in industry right now is there are not enough people that know how to build, stand up, operate machine learning infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So you can provide a lot of people tools, but right now the actual problem is a human resources problem, right? You just, companies can't hire enough of them. So is there a way maybe to outsource some of that machine learning or AI infrastructure so that, insert data, receive prediction mm-hmm. is more the model rather than I got to select my model and I got to train it and I got to do data augmentation and I got to have an explainability module and all this nonsense, which most companies just don't have the staffing to do that. Yeah. So, you look for pain points and you go, interesting. This company is fixing somebody's big pain point, and then you look for the right entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and you did recently, there was a Scale.ai, right, as an example of an AI infrastructure company. Do you want to talk about what those guys do?
Yeah, Scale's pretty simple. Most companies still that use machine learning use old-fashioned gradient descent, traditional machine learning. The data needs to be annotated. There's various philosophies on whether humans have to do the annotation of the data. And just to kind of give you an idea, annotation of data is I got a picture of a neighborhood with a person walking around, and some person in the Philippines has to draw a box around the person and the bicycle and the dog and the child and the traffic light and say traffic light, dog, child. You take thousands upon thousands upon thousands of those images and you feed them into the machine learning algorithm and it learns what to do, right? So companies spend ridiculous sums of money doing the annotation or labeling, because the more data, generally speaking, in a traditional machine learning world, more data, better accuracy. So Scale basically seized upon that notion and built kind of a interesting dual business model. On the one hand, they're a labor market. So they have people all over the world that do this labeling activity, and they do training of those people. They provide tools for them to be more effective and more accurate, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, they have a tool chain which does generally what's called pre-labeling. So essentially, one way to make a human more efficient is if you have to draw a box around something and you can guess that it's a human, you do, and then the person just says yes, as opposed to typing in human or doing a down selection box and saying like human. So they basically created a self of sort of pre-prediction infrastructure, and with that they became one of the, if not the largest labeler for self-driving. Now they're actually doing labeling for NLP, which is super interesting, because in that case, NLP, you have to have humans annotating text, but text comes in different languages. So they have, interesting things like there are colonies, former colonies in Africa where people are native speakers of certain languages that are high cost of living. So if you want Portuguese, you go to Angola. If you want German, you go to Mozambique. Yeah. And they make a reasonable living off of that. So very exciting company. It's growing super quickly.
And speaking of self-driving, which I guess is the ultimate AI machine learning problem, you're on the board of Aurora as well.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on where we are in that arc of from science fiction to actual science?
Well, so when you talk about self-driving, most people conjure up the image of there's a taxi in my neighborhood. That's the thing that we all think about. But if you actually think of the act of driving, there are many forms of driving which aren't your neighborhood taxi. There is freeway driving. There is the delivery of packages and goods. There's all sorts of other forms of driving. The adoption of self-driving technology will depend a great deal on what that end application is. And I've looked at a bunch of the stuff and so on and so forth. I think that the earliest adoption will actually be the movement of goods and not people. You can brute force the movement of people in neighborhoods to make it look cool, but it's not the most obvious. If you can move goods on a freeway, there is a huge labor shortage of truck drivers, and those truck drivers make $85,000, $90,000 a year, and there are government constraints around how much they can drive during a day. So if you could produce a self-driving truck, there is enormous economic value to be created, far exceeding in the short term what a digital taxi might, or a self-driving taxi might look like. Companies like Federal Express or UPS or Amazon are interested in delivering goods to your house. Those types of delivery services make your life much easier as a self-driving company because you know the route, right? And you can pre-plan the route. So if you know, for example, that you're coming up on a busy intersection, but you know that your next 5 stops look like this, you might choose a different route, skip that intersection entirely. So a lot of people get caught up in solving the hardest problem. And actually, if you think of the end use case, you can do a lot of self-driving while avoiding having to solve the hardest problem, right? And that is, to me, a much more swim with the flow than swim against the flow. And if you ask me, like, for those use cases, I think you're going to see self-driving trucks on freeways within the next 18 months. And you're going to see, for sure. As particularly with some of the newer LiDAR technologies that can see pretty far. So the biggest challenge on freeway driving is how far you can see. So with some of the newer frequency modulated LiDARs, you can see 500 meters. And if you can do that, you can drive on the freeway.
What else is interesting in AI these days? If I'm a young or not so young founder trying to figure out what to do with some machine learning skills? What are some of the areas that are interesting?
I mean, it all depends on sort of how practical you want to be, right? So if you want to be really practical in modern use cases, focus on tabular data with schemas that do really simple machine learning, like do fraud detection, do inventory forecasting, do simple, straightforward predictions, and just about every business in the world can use one. You know, that Starbucks stand right there could probably use a little machine learning to figure out how many beans they should be buying, right? That is a simple, very practical problem today that you can very easily say, I implemented machine learning and my thing is 20% more efficient as a result.
Interesting. So
Beautiful
start
win.
with so this structured data, which is easier, then unstructured data, which is much harder, and then
Yeah.
like
So if you're
images
trying to
and-
start a business and use AI, use structured data, use the simple stuff, use the simple machine learning models. Don't get fancy. Just use it, and there's already a nice gain. If you happen to be a computer scientist and you want to earn a lot of money, go spend time in deep learning, because I think that it's a technology that's been around since 2011, 2012. Its efficiency, I think, was questionable until sort of the last couple of years, but I think that there's been a lot of interesting stuff that's happening. There's super interesting stuff happening in natural language processing right now with deep learning. There's some of this BERT and GPT-2 stuff that Google has published is super interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff in self-driving where you can use deep learning, and it's such a new field. Like literally, they haven't been teaching this stuff for no more than 6 years. So I think that my kid is in college. She's studying computer science. I'm telling him take those deep learning classes because they'll pay you a lot of money when you graduate.
send me all your friends.
Exactly.
Actually, a little bit to that point. What do you look for in a founding team in machine learning or AI or even sort of data infrastructure? What do you look for? Super smart people? You look for people that come out of LinkedIn, like the Confluent people, or
the first thing I really like entrepreneurs who have felt the pain of the problem that they're trying to solve. Like if you look at Shai at Elastic, he had to stand up search for UBS, and it sucked. And
also had to search for his wife's recipes.
Yeah, that was a bit less so, but the UBS stuff was really painful for him, and so he decided. Jay Krebs, who started Confluent and was the original author of Kafka, he wrote Kafka to produce the LinkedIn feed. The LinkedIn feed was hard to make, and he made Kafka as in a pub-sub mechanism to do that. I love entrepreneurs that have felt the pain of the problem. That's a fantastic condition. I generally prefer, particularly if you're looking at machine learning, a lot of people will say they did machine learning, but if they did it more than 10 years ago, they did it in a pretty obsolete way. And so I would say that unless they've freshened up on it somehow, I tend to look for younger entrepreneurs, actually, that have seen the problem. And obviously entrepreneurs that have worked at companies that have used it at scale, Google, Facebook, Uber, Twitter, Airbnb, Pinterest, et cetera, definitely have an edge because they've actually, again, sort of empathized and seen the problem. But it's not just, you know this because you're an investor. Having the right technologists is half the battle. You got to have the right entrepreneur. And those qualities of a great entrepreneur are much more abstract, much more kind of human and esoteric than like, did you do machine learning for 2 years? And I think those oftentimes end up being more important.
And maybe to on that note and to close, and I'll open up for questions. So like flipping the table a little bit, what should founders look for in investors? How if you're lucky enough to have your pick of different firms, how do you decide who to work with?
I actually think entrepreneurs have their own guild, and they talk to each other, and they're very open with each other, and they don't tell us everything as they shouldn't. And I think the most important thing picking a VC, if you're lucky enough to have the choice, is to do reference calls. Call other founders that have worked with them and ask them all the right questions. And it's not like, how did you like Matt? That's not a good enough question. You should ask questions like, tell me how Matt helped you. Walk me through the circumstance. What decision that you make differently because Matt advised you in a certain way? How many candidates that Matt actually closed for you? Which customers did they introduce to you, and were they material? So, like, really dig in and understand, what that venture capitalist did, specifically the individual, not just the firm. A lot of entrepreneurs are like, oh, it's Sequoia, they must be good. I was like, okay, who at Sequoia, and what did they do specifically to help you? And I think those are the questions you really need to ask. And my view as a VC is, I live and die by my references. Good, bad, indifferent. Some entrepreneurs come to us and say, check my references, and I'll say, okay, well, give me 2 good ones and tell me 2 that failed. I want to talk to your entrepreneurs that failed. And what was that like? Because, obviously, our incentive scheme as VCs is work with all the good companies. If they're failing, like, move on to the next one, right? So did you help the companies when they were struggling? So referencing is, I think, super important. I think brand does matter to an extent, because it opens doors for you in the beginning on all the critical selling motions that you have to have. So whether it's a customer or somebody you're trying to recruit or a partnership with somebody that sort of opens doors, brand matters to a degree. So I put that as a second, but the most important thing is pick a VC that's actually going to be helpful, and verify that. And I don't think that you should, when you're selecting a VC, you shouldn't select a surrogate founder. That's not who they are. VCs are not your surrogate founders. They are your funders, and they are people who can help in critical moments. So don't think they're going to do your job for you, but assume that they should help you in the most critical moments.
Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
All right, we have one question here to start with.
Just recently, the government gave Azure a $10 billion contract over Amazon. Is it, in your opinion, because Azure is now superior in technology, or is there some kind of personal vendetta going on, or perhaps a bit of both?
I did hear that Donald Trump encouraged the department, whoever it was, to not use Amazon, but I don't think that was the case. I'm thankfully I live in this crazy city called San Francisco, and my office is in south of Market, and so 2 out of every 3 people that walk on the sidewalk are engineers. And so my operative question is, if I stopped them and did a poll, what did they start their development activity on? And I would say, the public market shares will say something like 60% Amazon, 20% Azure, 10% Google, and else. But if you actually polled engineers on the street, you probably get 85, 90% market share with Amazon. So in my mind, no matter what the government decides on whether they use the Azure cloud or Amazon cloud, Amazon is stratospherically dominant amongst developers right now still, which is not a good thing for us. It's not a good thing for our business, but it's reality, and you just have to deal with it, I think.
Got one over here.
Yeah.
How many women have you funded, and how do we get more women to get funded?
I have funded, my firm has probably about 20% of its CEOs that are women. I have funded, so this summer I did 3 companies that I invested in. One was led by a woman. Confluent had the co-founder was a woman.
She spoke at
Neha, she spoke at the event here. So I think don't get me wrong, I think the industry at large, and our firm included in this, has not done a good job at all funding against diversity or including diversity in our own firms. I think, absolutely, yeah, for sure. She was asking whether our firms have to be more diverse, and yeah, absolutely. I think everything starts with awareness. I think the awareness is higher. I still think that younger VCs will tend to ignore all those issues and just say, how do I get my hands on the best company? I don't care. And generally they tend to fund people that look like them. I think generally more experienced VCs will have a little more open-mindedness to it. What we also try to do is to promote our women founders. If you go to our website, there's a lot of pictures of women founders on there. And some of it, you might say, well, that's really self-serving. You're trying to just make yourselves look good. And I'm like, well, yes, but I mean, you got to start somewhere. So, we try to do as good a job as possible. But I will say, for example, now that we have 8 partners at Index, 2 are women now. And I will say they find more women entrepreneurs. They just do a better job. And, so I think it also starts from changing ourselves to change that bias that we have.
Let's do maybe just this one, maybe one more after that.
Thank you. You're obviously, you're VC, you're in the business of making money. There's a lot of data that's being collected, and I hear this expression all over the place, data is the new oil. And it's an expression that's out there. But there are a lot of unintended consequences to collecting data, storing data, living with that data. Do you invest in companies where there's caretaking of data in the sense where it's not exploited? And do you invest in companies where, I guess from a conscious perspective, are you investing in companies with that aspect in mind? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as a venture capitalist, you have to start with a rule of law, right? And so about half of our operation is in Europe. Europe has GDPR. GDPR has a reasonable set of protections there. So we operate within that environment, and obviously we 100% pay attention to the companies abiding by privacy laws as they stand today. The question might be, how far beyond that do we go? What moral judgment do we pass on the collection or use of data? And I'd say that's a very tricky one for a VC to think about, like to impose our own morality is a tricky statement. So I would say we definitely make sure that the rules are complied by. We tend to invest in businesses that produce data as opposed to collect data, but there are businesses that collect data for sure. And as long as they're compliant with the law and are not doing egregious stuff around it, we'll tend to fund them. Yeah. So, and the tricky thing is even this GDPR thing, right? It's fascinating because it comes into conflict with other American principles. Like in America, we have First Amendment rights. In Europe, there's no First Amendment rights. And so essentially, my form of self-expression might produce some data about you, and your desire to not have it in the public domain does violate my First Amendment rights. So you also have to understand the nuances of the geography within which you operate and the cultural norms, and abide by those. Another example, in the UK, we made an investment, some number is used, a company called Betfair. Betfair is a bookie, right? Essentially, it matches people that want to take a bet with somebody that want to take the other side of that bet. In the UK, that's legal, accepted, it happens in every street corner. A US investor would say like, whoa, betting, not good. We can't allow betting, that's like totally wrong. Depends where you operate and why. So you have to be thoughtful also about geographies, laws, cultural norms when you do investing.
All right. On that note, Mike, thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.